Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Compassion and Courage, Conversations in Healthcare. This is the podcast where I teach compassionate communication, provide perspective, and inspire resilience. And today I am so excited to bring to you for the first time on the show a social worker, and a social worker who is also someone who is my friend. This is Jeanette Altman. Jeanette, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I feel like in addition to your social worker duties, I'd also like to tell a story of advocacy on you. And it's a story you may not even remember.
I do.
You do remember this.
I
Okay.
do. I know what you're going to
You
say.
know what I'm going to tell. Okay, so friends, this was about 10 or 12 years ago. It was my last hospitalization. I had had several complications. Ended up actually two different hospitalizations. And it was a Friday afternoon, and Jeanette and her husband were visiting me in the hospital. And it seemed like the doctors they kind of had a plan, but it wasn't a really solid plan. And they thought I could kind of go home, but it'll take a while to get discharged. And in the process of this, Jeanette advocated for me by running down the hallway, grabbing the doctor, and saying, if he can get out of here today, help get him out. And the doctor did, and I got to come home a few days earlier than it would have been had we just let things run the normal course. So the advocacy angle certainly comes natural to you, and I'm so glad to know you and so glad for the work that you're doing today professionally in this area of advocacy and social work. Can you take us back a little bit? Like what was your first interest in doing this type of work?
Oh gosh, that's a question I get asked a lot. So I think maybe, sometimes we're born into roles without even knowing it. And I go back to when I was a child in school. So anytime I saw a kid being picked on or kind of marginalized, set to the side, I always befriended that kid or kind of stood up for that kid or advocated for that kid. So I think I've always been an advocate and not realizing there was a term for it called social work. Intentionally, when I went to school to get my AA degree, I always believed I wanted to work with children impacted by addiction. But at the time, I thought it was their own addiction I wanted to work with. So I went into the behavioral health sciences. And then full circle, I do work with youth impacted by addiction, but it's their family members' addiction. And I went down that road because my own father struggled with addiction and abuse. So I think being a product of that, I definitely, wanted to contribute and I guess share my own struggle and survivor thriver story.
Well, and not just survivor thriver story, but the idea too that I think those of us who have truly been, I don't like to use the word victimized for myself personally, although I do feel that's appropriate with a lot of situations and kids especially. But we don't want anyone else to be victimized. We don't want other people to have to suffer. And I'm so glad that that's led you to your professional work in this area. So I had the fortune a couple of years ago to work with some of these youth that you're talking about who were dealing with parental substance abuse addiction, and I'm sure some rather difficult situations in the family life arena. Could you take us back to your intro to this group of students and the camp?
I will. So I had just transitioned from a child advocacy center into JFCS as a parenting educator. And while I was there, my boss understood some of the skills I could bring to the team, and she asked if I would come out to the camp and teach the kids about stress reduction, how to manage stress. And so I went out, not really understanding what Camp Mariposa or the program was about, but when I got there and I realized, I'm like, oh my, these kids are me, 20 years ago. And when I realized this was a program teaching children that their parents' choices are not anything they have control over, it's not their fault, they can't fix it, but there are things they can learn how to do, it resonated with me. And I remember sharing it with my sister, and we both thought, wow, if we had a program at our young age teaching us that we were not in control of our parents' choices, that we could not fix their addiction, would we have made different choices growing up as teenagers and young adults? And I'm, to this day, not really sure if I would have made different choices, but maybe knowing I wasn't alone in my confusion, in my confusion, in my sadness about not having a father that I saw other kids have. Maybe my self-esteem would have looked differently. Maybe I would have made different choices. Maybe I wouldn't have kind of internalized the abuse and the addiction as somehow my fault.
Yeah, yeah. The way children frame things when there's no guidance, we can only use the tools that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And I love what you said there, just feeling like you're not alone. It's that presence that we talk about in acute care, that presence of letting people know that they're not alone in their suffering and their struggles. And again, it goes back to the idea that we talked about at the beginning, that we don't want other people to suffer in the same ways. If we can help ease that suffering, that's what we do.
Absolutely.
So we should say that this is a specific program in a specific part of Florida. We're not talking about a nationwide program. But can you tell us the stories about some of the students, the campers, the participants, the attendees that come to Camp Mariposa?
I will, but I will start out by saying Camp Mariposa is a part of a national program.
Is it wonderful?
Yes, we are.
Wonderful.
We are one of, I think, 18 in the nation.
Wonderful.
So yeah, so it is a national program. Let's see, some of the campers, there's a variety. So the one thing they all have in common, and I think that's the bonding for the beginning of a familial type of interaction, is that they all love somebody in their family that struggles with a substance use disorder. But then they all come with a similar story, but they all have their own unique perspectives. So some of these kids have picked up needles after their parent has passed out, and thrown them away. A lot of these kids have, experienced severe neglect. Some have been dropped off at a stranger's house and left for several weeks while their parents, go on their binges. Some of these kids have never met their parent that struggles with substance use because they've overdosed before they were old enough to remember their parent. Some of these kids have relationship with their parent in a prison because that's the only way they can see them. So the common denominator is their life has been impacted by family addiction, but the way they engage with their parents are different, with their families can vary.
And I think it's smart of us to point out that we're talking about that this is a camp and it's held at a campsite, and the kids do some camp stuff like, nature hikes and those types of things, but they're also sitting through a lot of sessions where you get into these issues that are specific to children of addicts. Is that right?
Yes, we call it a traditional fun camp weekend. So they're held once every other month, 6 camp weekends for youth 9 to 13, and then there's 5 for teenagers, 13 to 17. We call it a traditional fun camp with a twist, the twist being that it's therapeutic. So they do have an opportunity to share their story. They learn how to share their story and hear other people's stories without fixing them or adapting them or correcting them, which I think is the essence of holding space. Like in your story where you know, that your nurse was able to say, I'm here, and hold space for you while you went through your healing journey. And I think that's the goal, is that we teach these kids how to hold space for each other without judgment, without criticism.
And that's some of the definitions that we use for compassion with my pre-meds is that the opposite of compassion is judgment. And so I love what you're talking about, the stories there. That brings in a lot of narrative medicine aspects of storytelling.
Yes.
So what? Give me an example of how this works sometimes with students who are feeling maybe a pressure to tell their story in a different way than maybe accurate, or maybe a different perception.
Okay, so I'm going to see if I can answer this question. So one of the components when we start a camp, whether it's a Friday night start or a Saturday morning start, we have a section called My Story, Your Story, Our Story. And the way that's prefaced is I explain to the kids this is a time to share if you want. Nobody is required to share. So we don't want anybody to feel pressured or forced to talk about their experiences unless they feel they're ready. So my story is I'm allowed to share my story in a safe space without fear of judgment or correction. That I don't want anybody to tell me I should have felt differently or done it differently, or I should do this or that. All I want somebody to do is hear my story, accept it, and leave it at that. And then the your story part is that when you're sharing your story, that you're allowed to share it however way you remember it, whatever your perspective is, without fear of judgment or correction. And then the our story part is that how Camp Mariposa has impacted us or helped us or encouraged us. And it's really important. We have a lot of sibling groups, so the key is teaching siblings that even though they are in the same family, they may be having a shared struggle, that their perspectives may be different from their brother or sister. And it's really, really important that siblings don't correct each other and that they don't judge each other's stories. Because a lot of times families will say, a child will say, well, that didn't happen that way. This is the way it happened. But depending on a child's development stage, personality, or triggers, they may remember an exact event very differently from their siblings. And their siblings need to learn to just accept it for what their perspective is.
What kind of unique challenges do you have with a group of two or more siblings versus participants that come there alone?
So siblings, let's see, gosh, I have one family in particular I think about. So they're step siblings. They share a same parent, and then another parent is a step to several of these. So depending on the age, like we have one young camper who remembers their parent with a lot of affinity and affection and love, but also has to struggle with the reality that their parent was very abusive to a step sibling. And so they have to reconcile this person they love and have fondness for kind of is also, for lack of a better word, the quote unquote monster that really disrupted their family and hurt family members that they also care about.
And that has to come with a lot of emotion. That has to come with a lot of emotion. So other than yourself as a social worker and advocate on hand, what other types of professionals are helping guide these vulnerable young people?
I love that you asked that. My team of mentors is fabulous. So they all have professional careers outside of Camp Mariposa. So the weekends are once a month, so they come on a weekend. So we have a clinical director with Tidewell Hospice as a substitute nurse and a mentor. Our nurse on staff is a child protection center, part of a child protection team, and the medical nurse at that advocacy center. We have several police officers from Sarasota City on our team. We have educators, high school educators. I have a school principal at an elementary school that's on our team. A person in hospitality. We also have a licensed clinical social worker who is our clinical director, and she works with homeless youth in Manatee County. So the experience is vast.
And people that are just trying to help young people and help create a better society too.
Yeah.
Overall.
Well, I think they agree with me that, I mean, it sounds maybe cliche, but, children are our future. And I do believe if we can impact positively the life of a child or many children, we impact everybody they come in contact with. So we're not just impacting that child. It is every child, adult, in their future that child will be engaging in relationship with. It will even impact their own children. So, a lot of what we talked about is our goal is to break intergenerational patterns of addiction. So it's just ongoing.
It's so interesting. I was just going to ask you that a question about that. You say the intergenerational patterns of addiction, and I took a couple of social work classes in college, and one of which was substance abuse intervention. And we learned in that class, and again, this is going back a couple of decades, but that there is such a genetic component to addiction. So how do we also keep these young people not only feeling safe and emotionally and physically healthy in their environment where they're still growing up? What is done to also make sure that these participants, these campers, these young people, how do we break that intergenerational pattern of addiction when there's such a genetic component?
Right. So I will say there is a genetic component, but there is also a family dynamic component, for lack of a better word. A lot of education. So one of the core things we do at camp is we teach coping skills. We teach how to set goals, how to handle peer pressure, how using a drug or alcohol can impact their body and their brain. And then we also talk about the genetic component. And we have, so one of the beautiful things we have is we just now this year have 3 mentors on team that were campers 11 years ago. So, one of those campers, now mentor, went through her own addiction struggle because she actually used with her mother beginning at the age of 13. And has gone through her own struggle, her own recovery, and is very successful right now. And she can talk about that genetic factor. A lot of it is other people coming in and sharing their stories about how they thought they were fine, but they did take that one drink and lost 10 years of their life because of that. And so we do talk about the genetic factor being kind of Russian roulette. And we do activities around that to try to help them understand that even taking that first hit or that first sip could take them down a very precarious road.
Yeah, something to be super aware of if you've got addiction issues in your family tree.
Yeah.
When I think about young people coming together and this idea of how do you stand up to peer pressure? How do you make smart choices when the examples that you have in your own household are not wise and intelligent and legal?
Right.
What do you see those who are successful at trying to break this intergenerational addiction cycle? What do you see what do you see people doing specifically that helps them try to break that pattern?
I think them seeing themselves in their future. I don't know if that makes sense, but imagining a future and what that might look like, imagining things they would like to do. So we do a lot of, vision planning, goal setting, teaching them how to set little goals and the steps to those goals. And then we have them kind of go a little bit crazy and imagine bigger. Where do you see yourself? Right now that seems impossible, but what would the steps today, next year, and years from now have to take place for you to actually even be able to reach that goal, that long-term goal? And I do believe that the young adults that I know, the teens that I know, that are able to stand up to peer pressure, understand their self-worth. First of all, they begin to understand that their family addiction story doesn't have to be their long-term story. It's a part of their story. It does impact them, but it doesn't have to be their forever story. I think also being able to see themselves in their future helps them to say, no, that's what I really want. Teaching them that temporary game, it can also be destructive and keep them from those long-term goals or that vision in their future. And we celebrate those little successes every time they come up. So, for instance, we have two of our mentors that were able to get jobs with another campsite that we partner with. And, they were able to say, I'm working. I'm 15 years old, I'm working, I'm learning skills. And now they're 19 and they're enrolled in college. And it's so those little successes along the way that we are able to celebrate. I think that helps.
That's got to be just do the heart so good, right?
Mm-hmm.
To see those success stories.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a little bit about the idea of when we're sharing our stories, moving out of this idea of survive and thrive stories. Can you frame that idea a little bit more for me?
So are you talking about like the struggle story?
Yeah,
So,
yeah. You guys call it a struggle story, and in narrative medicine,
right.
we'd call it something different. But yeah, their struggle story.
So I do encourage the kids at camp. I encourage anybody. I think it's so, we live in this society where we always celebrate the success story. We applaud the success story. We are looking for those success stories. And I think sometimes that can add to lower self-esteem or, well, I'm not there, I'm not in comparisons. And so I try to really explain to the kiddos, and I even embrace this for myself, my struggle story is as valuable as any success story. And I don't even think we can think about getting to the success story until we've really embraced our struggle story. Our struggle story is who we are. It's part of the resilience. One thing I love about these kiddos, I'm like, you guys are here, you show up, you're resilient. And that struggle story of, I saw my mom pass out and I cleaned up her heroin needles, and I took care of my little sister. That was painful for me, but I also learned I have strengths. I can handle stress. I can problem solve even at a young age. What might I be able to do when I'm older? I just believe we have to learn how to, it's kind of like, I think I heard you and Marveline talk about grief not long ago. And we are so in our society uncomfortable with the uncomfortable feelings. We hear the be happy songs or, come on, let's stay positive. And I think we're in a society right now where we almost have positive toxicity. I'm saying it wrong. But we're almost on we're positive junkies, so to speak. And I think there's a value in sitting in the uncomfortable, in the hard. And I think it's brave to be able to share your struggle story.
And to be able to do so without judgment, without somebody reducing your story or dismissing your story or framing it in a way that doesn't seem authentic with your soul. And that's harder to
It
do,
is hard.
right? It's harder to do because, as you said, in our society, we're almost trained or conditioned that there was a hill to climb, but you got over it, and now you're a survivor and a thriver. And that may ultimately be what happens, but it also, we've got to leave time in there to just sit with the uncomfortable
Right?
feelings, the difficult feelings, the hard times, and simply acknowledge that those exist before we say, okay, you can climb that mountain,
Right.
right?
Well, and it's interesting. I just thought of something. Even these the former campers who are now mentors. Even at this last weekend, somebody said, I'm still learning. One of the mentors said, I'm still learning. I'm 20 and I've learned a lot, but I still realize how much more I have to go. And that's something we keep telling the kids. There's no magic date where it's all going to make sense and you're going to be okay. That does not exist. That's a fantasy. There is no point in time where you're going to go, oh, it's all good. I'm fine. I got it all together. I said, because, part of being resilient is that, struggle, overcoming, learning from it, learning how to benefit from it, and then reapplying it to the next struggle. And then again, overcoming, being resilient, and then again, applying it to the next struggle. So I think the struggle story is that there's an awareness that there's always going to be a struggle.
You just gave me a mantra to focus on for life. I'm still learning.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still learning. What a testament of humility and continual effort. I'm still learning. Boy, I think we all should take a lesson from that young
Right?
person who
Yeah.
shared that piece of
Right.
information.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with me today and sharing this extremely valuable information. I think, especially in the light of the last couple of years, we know that
Mm-hmm.
substance abuse has gone through the roof in our country during and now hopefully on the tail end of the pandemic. And I fear that you're going to have a lot of work to come for forever with children of
Right.
addicts. I think that's just the way that the world works. But I'm so glad that there is a program and camps around the country that help these very vulnerable young people who are struggling, and I'm awfully thankful for people like you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for,
Sure.
I guess, acknowledging the value in the work.
There is so much value in the work, and I share oftentimes that people assume that since I lost my sight due to an intoxicated driver, that I personally am
Right.
anti-alcohol, and that I have uh, a dislike for those who either drink or who are alcoholics or who are addicted to substances. I do not. I have nothing except empathy for those individuals. And I have so much empathy for those who are in
Right.
recovery. Those people are my
Mm-hmm.
heroes because if you can say, I've gotten way too into the sauce, I've gotten way too into the junk, and I need to change my life. That takes such a incredible amount of humility, and then it also takes a lot of strength to move through those processes. I'm just so thankful that those 12 step programs exist, that rehab
Mm-hmm.
places exist, and And then that there's places for the families too, like what
Right.
you're
And I
showing.
love that you said that because we do teach, one of our main components is making sure that these youth understand that, addiction is a disease. And one of the components, this is not about helping them learn how to hate their family member that struggles, but if anything, understanding what they as youth have no control or power over, and then understanding what they do have power over. We have had campers who have been removed from their parents for many, many years who are now reunified because those parents have gained sobriety and are working their recovery and have reunified and learning how to be a parent when they weren't. And it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing to see, that change come about. One thing I talk to those parents about is that you're creating a legacy. You're leaving a legacy for your children that while their struggle is hard, the ability to work through it is there. It's ever present. And whatever your story was in the beginning doesn't have to be the story for the rest of your life.
Mm, mm. That's a word right there too, right? The story that was your beginning doesn't have to be the story the rest of
Yeah.
your life. That's a beautiful piece of guidance. Jeanette, in the time we have left, can I shoot some rapid fire questions
Sure.
past you? All right. So and these are not professional in any
Okay.
way. These are just kind of fun questions. So let's say that you were living on the proverbial deserted island, and you've got all of your needs met, but you have the ability to have one piece of art with
Oh.
you, and whether this is a book, a film, a piece of visual art, a sculpture.
I can show it. I can show
What
it
piece
too.
of
I
art
have.
you can
I
show?
do. I
Okay.
have a painting that I love, and it's a painting of a face. It's about 5 feet tall and 3 feet wide, and it's multicolored, and it's of a side of a face of an eye, a nose, and half of a mouth, and it comes from a young lady who was bullied in high school. And as an artist, she painted this painting with her fingers as a way to express the pain she felt from being bullied and isolated and ostracized. And I love it.
And what a reminder visually of not only of her, but of that overall
Mm-hmm.
struggle, right? That so many youth are
Yeah,
dealing with. That's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
That's awesome. And next question for you is, let's say you opened up your purse or your wallet and you found that a $100 bill had magically appeared in there, and you have to spend this $100 on yourself in one day. What do you spend this
Oh
$100
gosh, many things come to mind. So as far as food goes, I'd probably, take a friend out and go have some sushi because
on?
I'm always about sushi. Um, let's see. Yeah, it would probably be food, you know. Food,
Yeah,
yes, a
yeah,
good meal, a really
yeah.
good meal.
And the
Mm-hmm.
experience of a meal with a
Yes,
friend, right?
absolutely.
Awesome. So, my last question for you then is, if you had the world's largest billboard on top of the world's tallest mountain, and you had the ability to put something on that billboard, what is your message to humanity?
Gosh, that's really big. You know what? My mantra at camp and with the kids and parents is what is mentionable is manageable.
Mm,
That would probably be it. If we can
mm.
talk about it, if we can be real, if we can be authentic, we can probably pretty much figure out how to navigate it.
That's a great piece of guidance too. What is mentionable is
Mm-hmm.
manageable. Wow. I'm gonna ponder that for a good long
Mm-hmm.
while. Jeanette, thank you so much for being with me today. Thank you for the work that you do. And again, thank you for advocating for me as a patient a long time ago. I'm so glad that there are others that are benefiting from your compassionate heart and your advocacy to try to make this world a better
Well,
place.
I thank you. Thank you for being here and letting the world and letting us know, and even coming out to Kemp and letting people know that being present is really a key. Yeah, being here.
It's what we can do. It's what we
Yes.
can do. What we can do when we can't do anything else. We
That's
can be
right.
present.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone today for being part of the Compassion and Courage podcast. This is the podcast where I teach compassionate communication, provide perspective, and inspire resilience. I want to encourage you to please go out and rate the podcast, review, subscribe, share, do all of those things, all those social media engagement tools, and we will see you next time on the next episode of Compassion and Courage. Thanks a lot.